The insurance adjuster was already photographing my dining room when I walked through the front door, his camera flash illuminating the water damage that had destroyed 42 years of memories. 3 weeks after Hurricane Miranda had torn through our coastal town of Millfield, leaving a trail of broken dreams and soggy photo albums in her wake. 3 weeks since I'd stood in the gymnasium at the community center, filling out FEMA paperwork alongside my neighbors, all of us wearing the same shell-shocked expression of people who'd watched their lives float away on dirty floodwater. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that no longer had curtains, casting harsh shadows across furniture that would never be the same. Everything smelled of mildew and loss, that particular odor of a home that had been violated by nature's fury. My grandmother's mahogany dining table, the one where I'd served Christmas dinner every year since Robert and I moved into this house, now bore water stains that looked like abstract art painted by disaster. I set down my purse on the kitchen counter, careful to avoid the area where the linoleum had buckled and curled like potato chips. The grocery bag in my other hand contained 3 cans of soup and a loaf of bread, the kind of minimal shopping you do when you're not sure if you'll still be living in the same place next month. When every decision feels temporary because nothing feels permanent anymore. Marcus stepped out from behind his camera equipment like he'd been waiting for this exact moment, clipboard in hand, wearing the kind of serious expression that insurance professionals perfect for dealing with other people's catastrophes. He was maybe 40, with the soft hands of someone who'd never had to gut a flooded house or pull waterlogged insulation from walls with his bare hands. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, consulting his papers like he was checking my identity against a most wanted list. "I've completed the initial assessment. We need to discuss your options moving forward." His voice carried that careful neutral tone that people in his profession learn, the kind that's supposed to sound sympathetic while delivering news that's anything but. Options. As if having your life's work destroyed by a hurricane left you with a menu of delightful choices to consider. I looked around at what remained of my home, at the baseboards that had swelled and split, at the hardwood floors Robert and I had saved for 3 years to install, now warped beyond repair. The kitchen where I'd packed thousands of school lunches and bandaged scraped knees and taught both my children how to make my mother's biscuit recipe from memory. Where Robert had proposed to me on a Tuesday morning in 1981 because he said he couldn't wait another day to make it official, dropping to one knee right there by the refrigerator while I was still in my bathrobe and curlers. Marcus spread a collection of forms across my damaged counter like he was dealing cards. "The settlement amount we're prepared to offer is $47,000, he announced, tapping his pen against the top document. "That covers the structural damage, contents loss, and temporary living expenses for up to 6 months. $47,000. I tried to attach that number to everything that surrounded me, to 4 decades of careful saving and thoughtful purchases, and memories that couldn't be quantified on any insurance form. The china cabinet that had belonged to Robert's mother, filled with dishes we'd used for every special occasion. The photograph albums that documented birthday parties and graduations and ordinary Tuesday evenings that had seemed unremarkable at the time but now felt precious beyond measure. "That seems low," I managed, my voice sounding strange in the empty spaces where furniture used to absorb sound and make this place feel like home. "I understand it's difficult to put a price on sentimental items," Marcus said, with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd had this conversation 1,000 times before. "But our assessment is based on fair market value, not emotional attachment. $47,000 is actually quite generous for a property of this age and condition." Age and condition. As if the laugh lines around my eyes somehow diminished the value of the life I'd lived within these walls. As if the settling that comes naturally to houses that have weathered decades of seasons was a character flaw rather than evidence of endurance. Just then, I heard the familiar sound of Thomas's truck in the driveway, the diesel engine that needed work but kept running anyway because my son had inherited his father's stubborn refusal to replace things that could still be fixed. I watched through the window as he climbed out, wearing his work clothes and carrying a briefcase that looked oddly formal against his paint-stained jeans. Thomas had been coming by every day since the hurricane, sometimes twice a day, always with suggestions about what I should do, where I should go, how I should handle the insurance claims and the cleanup, and the dozens of decisions that disaster forces upon you whether you're ready to make them or not. He meant well, I kept telling myself. He was just trying to help his mother navigate a situation that felt too big and complicated for someone my age to handle alone. "Mom," he called out as he walked through the front door, nodding to Marcus like they'd met before. Which they had, I realized. Multiple times, based on the way they greeted each other. "How are we doing with the paperwork?" We. As if this disaster belonged to both of us. As if the 42 years I'd spent in this house were somehow a joint investment that gave him equal say in how we proceeded. "Your mother and I were just reviewing the settlement offer," Marcus explained, organizing his papers with the efficiency of someone who did this for a living. 47,000, which should be more than adequate for her to start fresh somewhere more suitable. Somewhere more suitable. The words hung in the air like smoke, implying that my current situation was somehow inappropriate, that a 71-year-old woman living alone in a flood-damaged house was making a choice that wiser people wouldn't make. "Actually," Thomas said, pulling a folder from his briefcase, "I've been doing some research on senior communities in the area. Places that are better equipped for someone in Mom's situation." He spread brochures across my counter like Marcus had spread insurance forms, both men turning my kitchen into a conference room where decisions about my future could be made with charts and bullet points. Golden Sunset Village smiled up at me from glossy photographs, showing elderly people playing shuffleboard and sitting in circles for what the brochure called enrichment activities. Happy faces engaged in the kind of organized fun that made my skin crawl, the forced socialization of people who'd been gathered together not by choice or common interest, but by the simple fact that they were all old and no longer considered capable of creating their own entertainment. "Thomas, I haven't even decided what I'm doing about the house yet." "Mom, look around," he said, with the patient tone people use when explaining obvious things to confused children. "The house is destroyed. You can't stay here. The insurance money isn't enough to rebuild, and even if it was, you'd be looking at months of construction, contractors, noise, dust. At your age, that kind of stress isn't good for you. At my age, 71, wasn't 91, wasn't wheelchair-bound or oxygen-dependent or any of the things that actually made age a limiting factor. But Thomas had been treating me like an invalid since the hurricane, speaking to contractors on my behalf, making appointments without consulting me, assuming that disaster had somehow diminished my capacity to think and choose and plan. "Golden Sunset has everything you'd need," he continued, warming to his subject like a salesman who'd found an.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Interested customer. Meals provided, housekeeping, transportation to medical appointments, social activities. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or repairs or any of the headaches that come with homeownership. Headaches, as if the satisfaction of tending to your own space, of making decisions about paint colors and garden plantings, and whether to fix or replace the kitchen faucet, was some kind of burden rather than one of the fundamental privileges of adult life. Marcus cleared his throat, drawing our attention back to his paperwork. "If Mrs. Patterson is interested in a quick settlement, we could have the check processed within 2 weeks. Clean and simple, no lengthy repairs or restoration estimates. Clean and simple. Nothing about losing your home felt clean or simple. But I understood what he meant. Take the money, walk away, start over somewhere that other people had deemed more appropriate for someone my age and circumstances. The timing works out perfectly," Thomas added, pulling out another document from his folder. "Golden Sunset has an opening in their assisted living wing. It's usually a 6-month waiting list, but they had a cancellation." He said it like he'd won some kind of lottery, found a prize that should make me grateful for the hurricane that had created this opportunity. Assisted living. The words made my chest tighten. I didn't need assistance with living. I needed assistance with cleaning up after a natural disaster, with navigating insurance claims and contractor estimates. But I could still cook my own meals and manage my own medication and decide when to go to bed and what to watch on television. "I haven't agreed to move anywhere," I said quietly, But both men seemed to interpret my words as the opening position in a negotiation rather than a statement of fact. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering difficult but necessary truth. "I have to be honest with you about the reality of your situation. This property has sustained significant structural damage. Even with the settlement, you're looking at a major renovation project. Permits, contractors, inspections, code updates. It could take a year, maybe more, and cost twice what the insurance is paying out. A year. I tried to imagine living in some temporary situation for 12 months, while strangers rebuilt my home, according to current building codes and efficiency standards, that would erase every quirk and imperfection that had made this place uniquely mine. And that's assuming you can find contractors," Thomas added. "Half the town got hit by Miranda. Everyone's competing for the same workers, the same materials. Prices have tripled since the storm. They tag-teamed me like this was a rehearsed presentation, each one building on the other's arguments, painting a picture of obstacles and complications that would overwhelm someone of my limited capabilities and resources. But underneath their reasonable concerns, I sensed something else. An urgency that didn't quite match the measured pace of careful decision-making. "Why don't you let me take a look at these papers?" I said, reaching for the insurance settlement documents. "I'd like to read through everything carefully before making any decisions." "Of course," Marcus said, but he made no move to leave the papers with me. Though I should mention that this offer has a limited window. Insurance companies don't like to leave claims open indefinitely. The longer we wait, the more likely they are to find reasons to reduce the settlement amount. Time pressure, the oldest sales technique in the book, creating artificial urgency to prevent careful consideration. I'd seen Robert deal with enough contractors and salesmen over the years to recognize the tactic, but knowing it was manipulation didn't make it feel less threatening when you were standing in the ruins of your life. "How limited?" I asked. 30 days from today," Marcus said, consulting his calendar like he was checking an appointment. "After that, they'll want a new assessment, updated estimates, more documentation. It could delay things by months. 30 days to decide whether to accept their offer and abandon the home where I'd raised my children, buried my husband from the front parlor, hosted 42 Christmas mornings and countless ordinary evenings that had woven themselves into the fabric of who I was. "I think Mom should sign today," Thomas said, producing a pen from his shirt pocket like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. "Get this settled so she can focus on moving forward, instead of looking backward." Moving forward. Another phrase that sounded positive, but carried the implication that anyone who wanted to preserve or rebuild or stay connected to their past was somehow stuck, unable to embrace the future that other people had determined would be better for them. "Thomas, I need time to think about this." "Mom, what is there to think about? You can't live in a house with no working plumbing and mold growing in the walls. You can't afford to rebuild. The insurance company is offering you a fair settlement, and Golden Sunset is offering you a chance to live somewhere safe and comfortable with people your own age. People my own age." As if being 71 meant I could only relate to other 71-year-olds. As if age was the only thing we'd have in common. As if the friendships I'd built over decades in this neighborhood, with people ranging from 30 to 90, were somehow less valid than the artificial community of a senior facility. I looked around my damaged home, at the water stains and buckled floors and missing sections of drywall that revealed the skeleton of a house that had sheltered my family through 4 decades of joys and sorrows and ordinary days. It was hurt, not dead, damaged, not destroyed. With time and money and effort, it could be healed. But as I watched Thomas and Marcus exchange a glance that seemed to communicate more than their words had revealed, I realized that my son had already made up his mind about what was best for me. The question wasn't whether I wanted to rebuild my life in this place I loved. The question was whether I had enough fight left to resist the momentum of other people's certainty about what my future should look like. "I'll need to read through all the paperwork tonight," I said firmly, "before I sign anything." "Absolutely," Marcus agreed, but he was already packing up his papers, sliding them back into his briefcase like he was protecting them from my scrutiny. Though I do want to emphasize the time-sensitive nature of this offer. 30 days goes by faster than you might think. After both men left, Thomas promising to return first thing in the morning to help me work through the details, I stood alone in my wounded house and tried to make sense of the pressure I was feeling, Everyone seemed so certain about what I should do, so confident that their solutions were the only rational responses to my situation. But something felt wrong about the speed with which they wanted me to make irreversible decisions. Something felt calculated about the way Thomas had arrived at the exact moment Marcus was presenting the settlement offer. Something felt suspicious about the convenient timing of the opening at Golden Sunset Village. I walked through my house, room by room, really looking at the damage for the first time since the immediate aftermath of the hurricane. Yes, the floors were warped. Yes, the baseboards needed replacing. Yes, there was water damage and mold remediation needed. But the bones of the house were solid. The foundation was intact. The roof had held except for a small section over the back bedroom. This wasn't the total devastation Marcus and Thomas had painted in their urgent presentations. This was damage that could be repaired by someone who cared enough to invest the time and money required to do it right. That night, I sat at my damaged kitchen table with reading glasses and a cup of tea, determined to understand exactly what I was being asked to sign. The insurance settlement documents were dense with legal language and industry terms, but I'd learned to read contracts carefully during the years Robert and I had run our small accounting business together. The settlement amount of $47,000 was indeed what Marcus had claimed, but buried in the fine print were clauses I hadn't expected. By accepting the settlement, I would be agreeing not only to the payment amount, but also to a timeline for vacating the property. 60 days from the date of signing, whether I'd found alternative housing or not. 60 days. Not the leisurely transition Thomas had described, not the careful planning period I'd assumed would follow any decision to relocate. 2 months to pack up 4 decades of life and find somewhere else to call home. But there was more. Hidden in the legal language was a clause requiring me to sign over all rights to future claims related to the property. If mold problems developed after I moved out, if structural issues emerged that hadn't been apparent in the initial assessment, if environmental contamination was discovered, I would have no recourse against the insurance company. It was a comprehensive surrender disguised as a generous settlement. I kept reading, my tea growing cold as I worked through pages of terms and conditions. And there, near the end of the document, I found the clause that made everything else make sense. The insurance company wasn't just offering to settle my claim. They were offering to purchase my property for the $47,000, taking over the deed and assuming responsibility for all future development or demolition decisions. This wasn't a settlement. It was a buyout. I sat back in my chair, the full scope of what was happening finally becoming clear. Thomas wasn't just trying to help his aging mother make a difficult transition. He was trying to convince me to sell my property to an insurance company that clearly saw value in this location that went far beyond my damaged house. Millfield had been designated for redevelopment after the hurricane. The town council was pushing for modern construction, newer buildings that could better withstand future storms. Property values in the historic district had been artificially depressed by the flood damage, making it an attractive time for developers to buy low and rebuild high. My little house on Maple Street, with its mature oak trees and proximity to the downtown waterfront, wasn't just a flood-damaged liability. It was prime real estate being offered at disaster sale prices to people who knew exactly what it would be worth once the town rebuilt itself. The next morning, Thomas arrived before I'd finished my first cup of coffee, carrying a box of donuts from the bakery downtown and wearing the kind of determined smile that meant he'd prepared arguments for every objection I might raise. "Morning, Mom," he said, settling the donut box on my counter like he was establishing a base of operations. "I brought your favorites. Thought we could get this paperwork squared away, and then maybe drive over to look at Golden Sunset. I called yesterday and arranged a tour for 10 o'clock. A tour he'd arranged without asking me, for a place I'd never expressed interest in visiting. But I smiled and accepted the glazed donut he offered, buying myself time to figure out how to approach what I'd discovered in the fine print. "Thomas, I've been reading through the settlement documents. There are some things I don't understand." "What kind of things?" His voice carried a note of impatience, as if my questions were obstacles to a process that should have been simple and straightforward. "Well, for instance, this clause about transferring the deed. It seems like the insurance company isn't just settling my claim, they're buying my property." Thomas's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the practiced smile flickering for just a moment before reasserting itself. "That's just standard language, Mom. protects them from liability issues down the road, you don't need to worry about the technical details. Technical details. As if the transfer of property ownership was some minor administrative matter, rather than the fundamental question of whether I still owned my own home. But if they're taking over the deed, what happens if I change my mind later? What if I decide I want to rebuild here? Mom, you can't rebuild here. We've been through this. The damage is too extensive, the costs are too high. You need to focus on moving forward, not clinging to something that's already gone. Clinging. Such a dismissive word for the natural human desire to maintain connections to the places and things that had given your life meaning and continuity. What if the damage isn't as extensive as we thought? What if other contractors give different estimates? Thomas set down his coffee cup with the kind of careful control that suggested he was working hard to maintain his patience. Mom, I've already gotten 3 estimates. The numbers are all the same. $60,000 to $80,000 to restore this place to livable condition. Money you don't have, time you don't have, energy you don't have at your age. 3 estimates he'd obtained without involving me in the process, from contractors I'd never met, for work I'd never authorized them to bid on. Another piece of the puzzle falling into place. I'd like to see those estimates. Why? You're not qualified to evaluate construction bids. That's why you have me, to help you navigate this stuff. Navigate. Another word that positioned me as someone who needed guidance through waters too treacherous for me to handle on my own. Thomas. I may be 71, but I'm not incompetent. I ran a business with your father for 20 years. I can read a contractor's estimate. This is different, Mom. Construction is complicated, especially restoration work after flood damage. There are code issues, environmental concerns, insurance requirements. It's not like balancing books for small businesses. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable now, the patient explanation of why someone my age couldn't possibly understand the complexities that he, with his superior knowledge and capabilities, had already mastered on my behalf. I still want to see the estimates. Thomas opened his briefcase and pulled out 3 documents, spreading them on my counter with the air of someone humoring an unreasonable child. But as I looked at the letterheads, I noticed something odd. All 3 estimates came from companies I'd never heard of, with addresses in the next county over. Not local contractors who knew Millfield, who'd worked on historic properties before, who understood the particular challenges and opportunities of our area. Why didn't you get bids from local contractors? I asked. Most of them are booked solid through next year. These guys specialize in disaster restoration. They know what they're dealing with. But as I read through the estimates, I could see that these specialists had included costs for work that didn't need to be done, materials that were unnecessarily expensive, labor rates that seemed inflated even for post-disaster pricing. They'd estimated replacing systems that could be repaired, upgrading features that were perfectly functional, bringing everything up to commercial standards rather than residential requirements. These weren't restoration estimates. They were demolition justifications, designed to make rebuilding seem so expensive and complicated that selling would appear to be the only reasonable option. Thomas, some of these line items don't make sense. Why would I need to replace the entire electrical system when only the basement panel got flooded? Building codes have changed since this house was built. If you're doing major renovation, everything has to be brought up to current standards. But I'm not doing major renovation. I'm doing flood damage repair. Mom, you can't just patch things back the way they were. This is a chance to modernize, to make the place safer and more efficient. Or a chance to inflate the costs to the point where rebuilding became financially impossible for someone on a fixed income with limited resources. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead slipped into the bedroom where I kept my address book and called Henderson Construction, the local company that had built the addition on our house 15 years ago. Bill Henderson answered on the second ring. Bill, this is Eleanor Patterson on Maple Street. I was wondering if you could give me a rough estimate on flood damage repair. Eleanor, I heard about your house. Terrible thing. I've been meaning to call and offer my services, but figured you were probably swamped with insurance adjusters and out-of-town contractors. Out-of-town contractors. Exactly what Thomas had hired to evaluate my property. Could you come take a look sometime this week? I'm getting some conflicting information about what needs to be done. How about this afternoon? I'm in the neighborhood anyway, checking on the Morrison place. 2 o'clock work for you? When I returned to the kitchen, Thomas was on his phone, speaking in low tones to someone about timeline and closing dates and making sure everything stayed on schedule. He ended the call quickly when he saw me. Who was that? Just checking in with Marcus about the settlement timeline. Making sure we don't miss any deadlines. We don't miss any deadlines. As if this decision belonged to both of us. As if my future was a collaborative project rather than a personal choice that only I had the right to make. Thomas, I think I need more time to consider this. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the helpful sun mask slipped completely, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. Mom, you don't have more time. The insurance offer expires in 30 days, Golden Sunset has a waiting list, and every day you delay makes everything more complicated. Complicated for who? For you. For everyone trying to help you. Mom, I know this is hard, but sometimes life forces us to make changes we didn't plan. Dad's been gone 2 years, you're living alone, and now this hurricane has destroyed your house. Maybe it's time to accept that this is a sign you should simplify your life. A sign. As if natural disasters were messages from the universe directing elderly women to abandon their independence and accept the care and supervision of others. What if I don't want to simplify my life? What if you don't have a choice? The words hung between us like a challenge, and I realized that we'd moved past the pretense of helpful suggestions into the realm of ultimatums. Thomas wasn't trying to guide me toward the best decision for my circumstances. He was trying to force me into the decision he'd already made on my behalf. That afternoon, Bill Henderson walked through my house with the careful attention of someone who'd spent 40 years understanding how buildings worked and what it took to fix them when they broke. He made notes on a clipboard that was stained with sawdust and coffee rings, the working tool of a man who spent his days solving problems with his hands rather than shuffling papers in an office. Well, Eleanor, I won't lie to you, there's significant damage here, but it's not the disaster those out-of-town estimates made it sound like. He showed me what he was seeing, explaining in practical terms what needed to be repaired versus what needed to be replaced. The flooring could be refinished in most areas, not completely torn out. The electrical system needed some rewiring in the basement, but the main panel could be dried out and restored rather than replaced. The plumbing had survived better than expected because Robert had insisted on copper pipes when they'd renovated the bathroom 20 years ago. What's your ballpark figure for getting it livable again? 35, maybe 40,000 if you want to do some upgrades while we're at it. 6 months of work, maybe 8 if we run into unexpected issues. $40,000. Within reach of the insurance settlement, with money left over for temporary housing while the work was completed. A far cry from the $60,000 to $80,000 estimates Thomas had obtained from his disaster restoration specialists. Bill, would you be willing to put that in writing? Happy to. I'll have an official estimate for you by tomorrow morning. That evening, I sat with Bill's preliminary notes and the insurance settlement documents, finally understanding the full scope of what had been orchestrated around me. Thomas had convinced me that rebuilding was impossible by obtaining inflated estimates from out-of-town contractors who had no reason to give me honest pricing. Marcus had pressured me to make a quick decision by creating artificial deadlines and time constraints. And Golden Sunset Village had miraculously had an opening just when I needed somewhere to go, solving my housing problem in a way that kept me from looking too carefully at other options. It was a perfect storm of manipulation, designed to move me from homeowner to dependent in one swift transition. But I had something they didn't know about. Robert's voice in my head, reminding me of the lessons he'd learned in 40 years of running a small business. When everyone is pushing you to make a quick decision, slow down. When everyone agrees on what's best for you, get a second opinion. When something feels too convenient, look for what you're not being told. And what I wasn't being told was that my house could be repaired for a reasonable cost, that my property had significant value beyond the insurance settlement, and that I had choices they didn't want me to know existed. The next morning, Thomas arrived with more pastries and renewed urgency about getting the paperwork signed. But this time, I was ready for him. I've decided not to accept the insurance settlement, I announced before he could launch into his prepared presentation. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. What do you mean? I mean, I'm not signing the papers, I'm going to repair the house instead of selling it. Mom, that's not financially realistic. We've been through the numbers. We've been through your numbers. I got a second estimate yesterday from Henderson Construction. $40,000, 6 months of work. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions, surprise giving way to irritation, giving way to something that looked almost like panic. Henderson doesn't specialize in disaster restoration. He's not qualified to assess this kind of damage. He built the addition on this house. He knows the property, he knows the neighborhood, and he knows what it actually costs to do quality work around here. Mom, you're making a mistake. You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment. Sentiment. Another dismissive word for the complex web of memory and attachment and identity that connected people to the places they'd chosen to call home. Maybe I am, but it's my mistake to make. Thomas set down his coffee with the kind of controlled force that suggested he was working hard to keep his temper in check. You don't understand the larger picture here. This isn't just about fixing your house. It's about planning for your future, making sure you're secure as you get older. What I understand is that everyone seems very eager for me to make a decision that benefits them more than it benefits me. That's not fair, Mom. Everything I'm doing is for your own good, for my own good. The phrase that justified every act of control disguised as care, every decision made by someone else about what would be best for you. Thomas, whose idea was it for me to move to Golden Sunset? It's obvious you need more support than you're getting living alone. That's not what I asked. Whose idea was it? He shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding his coffee cup fascinating. We all just want what's best for you. We? Who is we? Your family, people who care about you. But, as I watched him avoid my eyes and fidget with his papers, I realized that the we he was referring to didn't include me. Decisions about my future were being made by a we that I wasn't part of, based on assessments of my capabilities and needs that I hadn't been consulted about. I want to see the Golden Sunset paperwork. What paperwork? The application you said you'd already filled out. The deposit you said you'd already paid. Thomas reached into his briefcase with obvious reluctance and pulled out a folder thick with forms and contracts. But as I read through them, I discovered information that changed everything I thought I understood about Golden Sunset Village and my son's eagerness to get me settled there. The facility wasn't just assisted living. It was a continuing care retirement community with different levels of service based on residents, needs, and financial resources. The cheapest option, basic independent living, had a waiting list of 18 months. But there was no waiting list for the memory care unit or the skilled nursing facility. And the paperwork Thomas had filled out on my behalf wasn't for independent living. It was an application for assisted living services, complete with a section he'd filled out documenting my supposed cognitive decline and inability to manage daily activities independently. According to his application, I was suffering from early-stage dementia, frequently confused about dates and times, unable to manage financial affairs, and prone to wandering and getting lost. He'd listed incidents that had never happened, described symptoms I'd never exhibited, painted a picture of a woman who needed constant supervision and care. Thomas, what is this? He glanced at the papers and his face flushed. That's just standard intake documentation. They have to assess everyone's needs to determine appropriate placement. This says I have dementia. It says you might be showing early signs. After Dad died, after the hurricane, it's natural for someone your age to have some cognitive issues. Someone my age. The magic phrase that justified every assumption about my limitations and every decision made without my consent. I don't have cognitive issues. I don't have dementia. I don't need assisted living. Mom, you're not qualified to make that assessment. I'm not qualified to assess my own mental state. People with cognitive decline often don't recognize their own symptoms. That's why families have to step in and make difficult decisions. Families. Another one of those plural words that made individual choices sound like group responsibilities. I looked at my son, really looked at him, trying to find the little boy who'd once trusted me to make decisions about what was best for him. who'd believed in my judgment and wisdom and ability to navigate complicated situations. When had he decided that the roles should be reversed, that he was now the parent and I was the child who needed guidance and protection from my own poor choices? Thomas, I want you to leave now. We're not finished talking about this. Yes, we are. I'm not signing the insurance settlement, I'm not moving to Golden Sunset, and I'm not accepting your assessment of my mental capacity. Mom, you're being unreasonable. I'm being independent. There's a difference. After he left, promising to return the next day with someone qualified to help you understand the seriousness of your situation, I sat alone in my damaged house and tried to make sense of what felt like a conspiracy designed to separate me from everything I'd worked to build and maintain. But I had Bill Henderson's estimate, I had my own assessment of what needed to be done, and I had something else that Thomas didn't know about. Something Robert had insisted on years ago, when we'd first started hearing stories about elderly people being taken advantage of by family members who had their own ideas about what constituted appropriate care and supervision. I opened the small fireproof safe hidden behind the bookshelf in the bedroom and pulled out the folder Robert had labeled just in case. Inside were copies of all our important documents, including a power of attorney that was very different from the one Thomas apparently believed he had access to. Robert had insisted we work with a lawyer who specialized in eldercare issues, someone who understood the difference between helping elderly people and taking control of their lives. Our power of attorney documents were written to activate only in case of genuine incapacity, verified by multiple independent medical assessments, not by family members who thought they knew what was best. I also found something else in Robert's just-in-case folder, the deed to a small cottage in the mountains, 2 hours north of Millfield, that we'd inherited from Robert's uncle 3 years ago. We'd visited it twice, both times talking about fixing it up as a retreat, someplace to spend summers when the coastal humidity became unbearable. It needed work, but it was structurally sound, sitting on 5 acres of timber with a creek running through the back of the property. More importantly, it was mine, free and clear, with no mortgage and no insurance company eager to buy it out from under me. I had choices. Real choices, not the carefully curated options that Thomas and Marcus had presented as my only alternatives. That night I called my friend Margaret, the only person I trusted to give me honest advice without trying to manage my decisions. Eleanor, I've been worried about you since the hurricane. How are you holding up? I'm holding up fine, but I'm not sure I can say the same for my relationship with Thomas. I told her everything, the insurance settlement, the Golden Sunset application, the inflated repair estimates, the pressure to make quick decisions about irreversible changes. Oh, honey, Margaret said when I'd finished. You're not the first woman to go through this. My sister went through the exact same thing when her husband died. Kids swooped in like vultures, convinced they knew better than she did about what kind of life she should be living. Sold her house out from under her, put her in one of those places where they treat you like you're already half dead. Margaret's words confirmed what I'd been feeling but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. This wasn't love disguised as tough decisions. This was control disguised as care, financial opportunism disguised as family concern. What did your sister do? She fought back, but it took her 2 years and cost her most of her savings in legal fees. Eleanor, you need to get ahead of this before Thomas makes any more moves on your behalf. Get yourself a good lawyer, document everything, make sure your own wishes are legally protected. The next morning, I called Diane Foster, an attorney who specialized in elder law issues and had a reputation for refusing to let families steamroll their elderly relatives into decisions they didn't want to make. Her office was downtown, in one of the historic buildings that had survived the hurricane with minor damage, a reminder that some things were built to last and could weather storms that seemed devastating in the moment. Diane was about 50, with the kind of direct manner that made you trust her within the first 5 minutes of conversation. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes in a legal pad that was already thick with similar cases. Mrs. Patterson, what you're describing is unfortunately very common. Adult children who convince themselves they're acting in their parents' best interests while making decisions that primarily benefit themselves. Sometimes it's conscious fraud, sometimes it's unconscious paternalism, but the result is the same. The elderly person loses control over their own life. Is what Thomas is doing legal? Depends on how he goes about it. If he's simply pressuring you to make certain choices, that's unethical but not necessarily illegal. But if he's forging documents, making false statements about your mental capacity, or trying to exercise power of attorney that doesn't exist, then we're talking about potential fraud. She reviewed the Golden Sunset application Thomas had filled out, reading through his detailed descriptions of my supposed cognitive decline and care needs. "This is concerning," she said, tapping her pen against the papers. "He's creating a paper trail that could be used to support a guardianship petition. If you ended up in the hospital, if you had any kind of medical emergency that left you temporarily incapacitated, this documentation could be used to argue that you're unable to make your own decisions." A guardianship petition. The legal mechanism that would officially transform me from an independent adult into someone whose life was managed by court-appointed supervision. The ultimate loss of autonomy, disguised as protection. What can I do to prevent that? Several things. First, we're going to get you evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist who can document your cognitive functioning. Second, we're going to update your advance directives and power of attorney documents to make your wishes absolutely clear. Third, we're going to send a letter to Golden Sunset withdrawing that application and clarifying that Thomas had no authority to submit it on your behalf. Over the next week, I followed Diane's advice methodically. Dr. Sarah Chen, a geriatric psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, spent 2 hours evaluating my mental status, memory, decision-making capacity, and ability to understand complex information. Her report was unambiguous. I showed no signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or any condition that would impair my ability to make independent decisions about my life and care. Armed with Dr. Chen's evaluation, Diane drafted new legal documents that made my wishes crystal clear. If I ever became genuinely incapacitated, my care decisions would be made by a professional guardian, not by family members who might have their own agenda. My financial affairs would be managed by a trust company, not by relatives who stood to benefit from particular choices about my assets. But more importantly, the documents specified exactly what constituted incapacity, requiring multiple independent medical evaluations and court oversight before anyone could claim the right to make decisions on my behalf. Meanwhile, Bill Henderson had begun the repair work on my house, starting with the most critical structural issues and working systematically through the damage. It was satisfying to watch the place come back to life under the hands of someone who understood both the building and my vision for restoring it. The kitchen floor, once warped beyond recognition, was being carefully refinished to preserve the original wood where possible. The damaged drywall was being replaced with period-appropriate materials that matched the character of the house. Even the baseboards were being restored rather than simply replaced with modern equivalents. Thomas returned, as promised, bringing someone he described as a qualified professional to help me understand the seriousness of my situation. The qualified professional turned out to be Janet Morrison, a social worker from the County Aging Services Department, who introduced herself with the kind of condescending warmth that made my teeth ache. "Mrs. Patterson, your son is very concerned about your welfare. He's asked me to do a home assessment to determine what kind of support services you might need. I haven't requested an assessment. Sometimes family members are the first to notice when an elderly person needs additional help. It's quite common for seniors to resist acknowledging their changing needs. Seniors, elderly person, changing needs. The language of diminished expectations and managed decline, as if turning 71 automatically placed me in a category of people who couldn't be trusted to understand their own circumstances. Janet walked through my house with a clipboard, making notes about everything from the repair work in progress to the medications in my bathroom cabinet. She asked questions that sounded supportive, but were clearly designed to uncover evidence of impairment or poor judgment. "Have you been having any trouble managing your finances since your husband passed?" "No, I've always handled the household budget." "Any difficulty remembering to take medications or keeping track of appointments?" "No, I use the same system I've used for 20 years. Your son mentioned that you've seemed confused about some recent events. Have you been having any problems with memory or concentration?" "The only thing I've been confused about is why everyone seems to think I'm incapable of making my own decisions." Janet made a note on her clipboard, the kind of careful documentation that suggested my response was somehow evidence of the problem she was investigating, rather than a reasonable reaction to unwanted interference. Mrs. Patterson, resistance to help is often a sign that someone needs more support than they're willing to admit. It's very common in people who are experiencing cognitive changes. The circular logic was maddening. If I accepted their help, it proved I needed supervision. If I refused their help, it proved I was too impaired to recognize my own needs. Either way, the conclusion was the same. I couldn't be trusted to manage my own life. But I had Dr. Chen's evaluation in my purse, along with Diane Foster's business card and a clear understanding of my legal rights. When Janet asked to see my medications, I referred her to my physician. When she asked about my financial management, I referred her to my attorney. When she asked about my plans for ongoing care, I told her they were private medical decisions that I would make in consultation with my doctors. Mrs. Patterson, I have to file a report with the county. Based on what I've observed today, I'm recommending a more comprehensive evaluation to determine your capacity for independent living. You're welcome to recommend whatever you think is appropriate, I said calmly. But I won't be participating in any evaluation that I haven't consented to with my own legal representation present. After Janet and Thomas left, clearly frustrated by my refusal to cooperate with their assessment process, I called Diane to let her know what had happened. "They're escalating," she said. "This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic pressure tactic I was worried about. Janet's report will go into the county files, and if Thomas decides to pursue guardianship, they'll use it as evidence that you're not cooperating with reasonable offers of assistance." What do? We get proactive. I'm going to file a preemptive motion with the court establishing your competency and your right to refuse unwanted services. We'll attach Dr. Chen's evaluation and make it clear that any future attempts to question your capacity will need to meet a very high legal standard. But even as Diane worked to protect my legal rights, I could feel the social pressure building around me. Mrs. Henderson from next door mentioned that Thomas had called her, asking if she'd noticed any changes in my behavior since Robert died. The postman commented that my son seemed very concerned about my welfare, implying that maybe I should listen to someone who cared so much about my safety. Even Dr. Williams, my family physician for 15 years, seemed to have gotten a call from Thomas expressing concerns about my decision-making abilities. "Eleanor, your son mentioned that you're planning to stay in the house during extensive renovation work. Are you sure that's safe for someone your age?" Someone my age. The phrase that had become a constant refrain in every conversation about my future, as if my birth certificate was more relevant than my actual capabilities or preferences. "Dr. Williams, do you have any medical concerns about my ability to live independently?" "Well, no, but Thomas seems to think you might benefit from a more structured living situation." "Thomas isn't my doctor. You are. If you have medical reasons to be concerned about my independence, I'd like to discuss them. If not, I'd appreciate it if my son's opinions about what's best for me weren't treated as medical advice." The web of concern and intervention that Thomas had built around me was impressive in its scope and coordination, but it was also built on a foundation of assumptions about my limitations rather than evidence of actual impairment. And the more I pushed back against those assumptions, the clearer it became that this wasn't really about my welfare at all, it was about control. About Thomas's belief that he knew better than I did, what kind of life I should be living, what risks I should be allowed to take, what choices I should be permitted to make. 3 weeks into the renovation work, I found the proof I'd been looking for. Bill Henderson discovered something during the electrical work that explained why Thomas had been so eager to get me to sell quickly and quietly. "Eleanor, you need to see this." Bill called from the basement, his voice carrying the kind of excitement that suggested he'd found something important. I climbed down the stairs carefully, mindful of the construction materials and exposed wiring. Bill was standing near the back wall, holding what looked like a property survey. I found this tucked up in the ceiling tiles when we were running new electrical lines. Looks like someone had it professionally surveyed about 6 months ago. The survey showed my property, but with boundary lines that were different from what I'd always believed. According to this document, my lot extended 15 feet further to the east than I'd known, including a strip of land I'd always assumed belonged to the city. What does this mean? It means your property is bigger than you thought. But more importantly, look at this notation here. Bill pointed to a series of markings along the eastern boundary. This shows access to the waterfront. Eleanor, you don't just own the lot your house sits on, you own water rights to the harbor. Water rights. In a coastal town that was rebuilding after hurricane damage, with developers eager to create new marina facilities and waterfront condominiums, water rights were incredibly valuable. More valuable than anyone had told me when they were pressuring me to accept a quick settlement and move somewhere more suitable for someone my age. Who ordered this survey? Bill checked the paperwork. Morrison Development Group. Any relation? Morrison. Thomas's middle name, the same surname as his ex-wife. The development company that had apparently been planning for my property long before the hurricane provided the perfect opportunity to acquire it at disaster relief prices. That evening, I called Diane Foster with this new information. Eleanor, this changes everything. If Thomas has been working with developers while simultaneously pressuring you to sell, we're looking at a clear conflict of interest. Possibly fraud, depending on how long this has been in the works. What should I do? Nothing dramatic. Let's gather more information first. I want to research Morrison Development, find out who the principals are, what other properties they've been involved with since the hurricane. And I want to have that survey independently verified. But even as Diane worked to build a legal case, I realized that I didn't want to spend the next year of my life fighting with my son in court, documenting his betrayals, and proving his manipulation. I had better things to do with whatever time I had left than engaging in legal warfare with someone I'd raised to be better than this. I had the cottage in the mountains. I had enough money from Robert's life insurance to make it habitable. I had a choice that no one else knew about, an option that would let me disappear from this whole ugly situation and start over somewhere that nobody was trying to manage my life for my own good. The next morning, I drove 2 hours north to see the cottage again, this time not as a someday project but as a real possibility for right now. It was smaller than I remembered, more rustic than I'd idealized, but it was solid and private and surrounded by the kind of natural beauty that made you remember why you were glad to be alive. The roof needed some work, the kitchen was 30 years out of date, and the single bathroom would benefit from modernization. But the bones of the place were sound, the well water was clean, and the wood-burning stove would heat the whole space efficiently. Most importantly, it was mine. Free and clear, with no mortgage payments, no insurance company trying to buy me out, no son trying to convince me that I was too old and incompetent to live where I chose. I spent 3 days at the cottage, making lists of what needed to be done and what I could live with temporarily. By the time I drove back to Millfield, I had a plan that had nothing to do with anyone else's ideas about what would be best for me. I called Bill Henderson and asked him to shift his crew to the cottage to make it livable by the end of the month. Then I called a moving company and arranged to have my essential belongings transported north as soon as Bill's work was finished. Finally, I called Diane Foster and asked her to prepare a letter to Thomas, officially notifying him that I was withdrawing from any settlement negotiations and would not be moving to Golden Sunset or any other facility he had selected for me. Eleanor, are you sure about this? You have a strong case against Thomas if you want to pursue it. We could probably force him to pay damages for the stress and expense he's caused. Diane, I'm 71 years old. I don't want to spend whatever good years I have left fighting with my son about who gets to control my life. I want to spend them living the life I choose in the place I choose, on my own terms. What if he tries to follow you? What if he decides the cottage isn't suitable either? Then I'll deal with that when it happens, but at least I'll be dealing with it from a position of strength, in a place where I feel at home, rather than constantly defending myself from other people's ideas about what I should want. Thomas arrived at my house the next morning, with Marcus the insurance adjuster and Janet the social worker, clearly expecting to present me with some kind of united front that would finally convince me to accept their collective wisdom about my future. Instead, he found me packing boxes in a house that was clearly being prepared for abandonment, not renovation. Mom, what's going on? I'm moving. Moving where? Somewhere that nobody thinks I'm too old to make my own decisions. I handed him Diane's letter, which formally notified him that I was declining all settlement offers, withdrawing from any care facility applications he had submitted on my behalf, and instructing him to cease making any representations about my mental capacity or care needs to third parties. You can't just disappear. I'm not disappearing, I'm relocating. There's a difference. Where? That's not your concern anymore, Thomas. Marcus and Janet tried to intervene, explaining patiently that I was making decisions based on emotion rather than logic, that I was letting pride prevent me from accepting help I obviously needed. But their words felt hollow now that I understood the financial interests that were driving their concern for my welfare. Mrs. Patterson, Janet said in her most professional voice, I have to file a report stating that you're planning to move to an unknown location without adequate support systems in place. The county has a responsibility to ensure that vulnerable adults aren't placing themselves at risk. Ms. Morrison, I've been evaluated by a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist who found no evidence of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. I have legal representation who has reviewed my decisions and found them reasonable. I have medical clearance for independent living from my physician. What exactly makes me vulnerable in your professional opinion? She consulted her clipboard, searching for language that would justify her continued intervention. Your age, your recent bereavement, your history of depending on your late husband for certain types of decision-making. My age is a number, not a disability. My bereavement is a normal response to loss, not a mental illness. And my history of collaborative decision-making with my husband doesn't mean I'm incapable of making decisions independently. But even as I defended my competence, I could see that they weren't really listening to my arguments. They had already decided that a 71-year-old widow who refused to accept their help was by definition someone who needed their help, whether she wanted it or not. The circular logic was maddening, but it was also irrelevant. In 3 days, I would be gone, living in a place where these people had no jurisdiction and no ability to continue their campaign of forced assistance. That afternoon, I walked through my house one more time, saying goodbye to 42 years of memories. The kitchen, where I'd taught both children to cook, where Robert had surprised me with birthday cakes and anniversary dinners, where we'd sat over coffee every morning discussing the day ahead and every evening reviewing what had been accomplished. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents and watched television and argued about everything from politics to what color to paint the bathroom. The bedroom where both children had been conceived, where Robert had died holding my hand, where I'd spent 2 years learning to sleep alone. It was hard to leave, but it was harder to stay and watch other people turn my home into evidence of my incompetence, my independence into proof of my need for supervision. The cottage felt different when I arrived with my belongings and the intention of making it home rather than just visiting it as a possibility. Smaller, certainly, but also cozier. Quieter, but peaceful rather than lonely. Isolated, but in a way that felt like privacy rather than abandonment. Bill had done good work in the 3 weeks I'd given him. The roof was sound, the kitchen functional, the bathroom modernized enough to be comfortable. The wood-burning stove heated the main living area efficiently, and the bedroom stayed warm enough for sleeping even on the coldest nights. Most importantly, it was mine in a way that felt absolute and unquestionable. Nobody was going to knock on my door with papers to sign, or assessments to complete, or suggestions about where I should be living instead. I spent my first week organizing the space and learning the rhythms of this new life. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away through the woods, an older man named Frank who raised chickens and minded his own business. The closest town was 15 minutes by car, big enough to have a grocery store and a post office, but small enough that nobody assumed I needed supervision just because I was buying my own groceries. Dr. Peterson, the local physician, was about my age and had been practicing in rural medicine long enough to understand the difference between patients who needed medical care and patients who needed to be left alone to live their lives. When I established care with his practice, he asked about my medical history and current medications, not about my family's concerns or my living arrangements. "You seem to be managing fine on your own," he said after my first appointment. "Let me know if anything changes. No assumptions about my limitations, no suggestions about what might be more appropriate for someone my age, No implications that independence was something I should be gradually surrendering in preparation for inevitable decline. 3 months into my new life, Thomas found me. I'd been expecting it, had even prepared for the conversation we would need to have about boundaries and respect, and the difference between helping someone and controlling them. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, driving the same truck he'd been using to transport contractors and social workers and insurance adjusters through my old life. But this time, he was alone, and he looked uncertain in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager facing consequences for poor choices. "Mom, Thomas." We stood on my front porch looking at each other across the gap that his lies and manipulation had created, both of us knowing that our relationship would never be the same as it had been before. I learned what he was capable of doing in the name of love and concern. "I was worried about you. Were you worried about me or worried that I'd escaped from the life you'd planned for me?" He had the grace to look ashamed. "I thought I was doing what was best for you." "No, you thought you were doing what was easiest for you. What was most profitable for you. What gave you the most control over a situation that you found inconvenient." "That's not fair. Thomas, you lied to me about the condition of my house. You lied to me about your authority to make decisions on my behalf. You filled out applications for care facilities without my consent, describing symptoms I don't have and needs I don't experience. You brought strangers into my home to evaluate my competence based on your false reports about my mental state. What part of that was fair to me?" He sat down heavily in the rocking chair I'd placed on the porch for watching sunsets over the mountains, suddenly looking older than his 45 years. "I was scared, Mom. After Dad died, after the hurricane, I was scared that something would happen to you, and I wouldn't be there to help. I was scared that you'd get hurt, or sick, or confused, and I'd have to live with knowing I didn't do enough to protect you. So you decided to protect me by taking away my right to make my own choices? I decided to protect you by making sure you were somewhere safe, with people who could take care of you if you needed it. Thomas, I lived independently for 23 years before I married your father. I ran a business, raised 2 children, managed a household, dealt with crises and emergencies and complicated decisions. What exactly made you think that your father's death had somehow erased all of those capabilities? You seemed so lost after he died, so overwhelmed by everything you had to handle on your own. I was grieving, not incompetent. There's a difference." We sat in silence for a while, watching the afternoon light move across the mountains, both of us thinking about the year that had passed since the hurricane had given him the excuse he'd been looking for to reorganize my life, according to his ideas about what would be best for me. "How did you find me?" "Private investigator. Cost me $3,000. $3,000 to track down a mother who'd made it clear she didn't want to be found by someone who'd demonstrated such a fundamental lack of respect for her autonomy and judgment. Why? Because you're my mother. Because I love you. Because I was wrong about how I tried to help you, but that doesn't mean I was wrong about wanting to make sure you're okay." "I'm more than okay, Thomas. I'm happy. For the first time since your father died, I'm genuinely happy. I wake up every morning in a place I chose, living a life I designed, making decisions based on what I want rather than what other people think I should want. It's so isolated here. What if something happens to you? Then something happens to me. Thomas, I'm 71 years old. Something is going to happen to me eventually no matter where I'm living or who's supervising my daily activities. But until that something happens, I want to spend my time living on my own terms, taking the risks I choose to take, making the mistakes I'm willing to live with. I just want to know that you're safe." I am safe, but more importantly, I'm free. And if I had to choose between safety with supervision and freedom with risk, I'll choose freedom every time. He stayed for dinner, helping me prepare a simple meal in my small kitchen, both of us carefully avoiding the topics that had driven us apart. We talked about his work, about his children, about the weather and the news and the ordinary subjects that families discuss when they're trying to rebuild trust that has been damaged by betrayal. But underneath the careful conversation, I could feel him evaluating my living situation, assessing my competence, looking for evidence that I was or wasn't managing well on my own. The old patterns of assumption and judgment were still there, just temporarily suppressed by the awkwardness of being caught in lies and manipulation. Mom, I know you're angry with me, I know I handled things badly. But if you ever need anything, if you ever change your mind about wanting help with anything, I hope you'll call me. Thomas, the help you offered wasn't help. It was control disguised as care. If you can learn the difference between those two things, if you can learn to respect my choices, even when they're not the choices you would make for me, then maybe we can rebuild some kind of relationship. What if I can't tell the difference? What if I think I'm helping, but I'm really just trying to control things again? Then ask me. Don't assume, don't decide on my behalf, don't bring in professionals to evaluate my competence or my living situation. Just ask me what I want, what I need, what would actually be helpful. And if I say no, respect that answer instead of trying to find ways around it. After he left, I sat on my porch in the gathering darkness, listening to the sounds of the forest settling into night. Owls calling to each other across the valley, small animals moving through the underbrush, the creek running over stones worn smooth by decades of water and weather. These were the sounds of a life chosen rather than assigned, of independence earned rather than surrendered, of a future that belonged to me regardless of what other people thought would be more appropriate for someone my age. 6 months later, Thomas called to let me know that the house in Millfield had finally sold. Not to the insurance company or to Morrison Development, but to a young family who planned to restore it to its original character while adding modern conveniences. They're keeping Dad's workshop in the basement, he told me. The wife is an artist, and she wants to use it as a studio. They're excited about the garden space, planning to grow vegetables, and maybe add some fruit trees. It was good to know that the house would continue to be a home, rather than being demolished for condominiums or marina development. Good to know that another family would create memories within those walls, that children would run through rooms where my children had once played. Thomas, I'm glad it worked out that way. Mom, I need to tell you something. The private investigator I hired to find you, he also looked into Morrison Development. It was Linda's idea, after our divorce was final. She thought it would be a good investment opportunity, buying properties from people who couldn't afford to rebuild after the hurricane. Linda, his ex-wife, who'd always been more interested in financial opportunities than family relationships. The missing piece of the puzzle that explained how he'd convinced himself that pressuring me to sell was somehow in my best interest. How long had you been planning this? Since right after Dad's funeral. Linda pointed out that you'd probably want to downsize eventually anyway, that it made sense to help you transition to something more manageable before you got too old to handle the change. Too old to handle the change. As if there was some magic age at which people lost the ability to adapt, to learn, to make decisions about their own lives. Thomas, I want you to understand something. What you and Linda planned wasn't help. It was exploitation. You were planning to profit from my grief and vulnerability, to use a natural disaster as an excuse to take control of assets that belonged to me. I know that now. I've known it for months, but I didn't know how to admit it to you. I didn't know how to say that I let someone else convince me to treat my own mother like a business opportunity instead of like someone I love. The first step was admitting it to yourself. The second step is making sure you never do anything like that again. I won't. I promise, Mom. I'll never try to make decisions for you again without asking you first. A year and a half after the hurricane, I received a letter from Golden Sunset Village, asking if I was still interested in their services and offering me a place on their waiting list for independent living apartments. I wrote back to thank them for their continued interest, but explained that I was very happy with my current living situation and would not be needing their services in the foreseeable future. Then I walked out to my garden, where I was growing tomatoes and peppers and the best sweet corn I'd ever tasted in soil that belonged to me, on land that no one was trying to convince me was inappropriate for someone my age. The mountains were beautiful in the late afternoon light, painted gold and purple by the setting sun. The creek was running clear and cold, fed by springs that had been flowing since long before I was born, and would continue flowing long after I was gone. This was the life I had chosen for myself, the independence I had fought to preserve, the freedom I had been willing to risk everything to maintain. Not the life that other people thought would be safer or more practical, or more suitable for a 71-year-old widow, but the life that made me glad to wake up every morning and grateful to have the strength and clarity to live it on my own terms. And if something happened to me tomorrow, if I fell and broke a hip, or had a stroke, or simply died peacefully in my sleep, I would die knowing that I had spent my final years living as myself rather than as someone else's idea of who I should be. That was worth more than any amount of safety or supervision or professional care that could be purchased with the price of my autonomy. That was worth everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.